Thank you, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome everybody. It's a big honor for me to be here on the side of the Atlantic Ocean. My topic is perhaps not so close at first sight, the whole Ukrainian issue, and we saw how the Maslow pyramid of security studies is working when we are speaking on nuclear potential of a nuclear war and the escalation of war in Eastern Europe. Food security and migration seems a secondary or thirdly issue, but it's, as Monica mentioned, as energy is weaponized and instrumentalized in this context, we can see food crisis as migration in some aspect also instrumentalized and weaponized in the global theater. The research, during the research methodology, which was conducted in the framework of the OTKA project of the Hungarian Academy of Science, based in the National University of Public Service Cooperation with the Migration Research Institute, is trying still to map the consequences of the war, and mainly the effects of food crisis in Africa. And it's very important to underline that the war in Ukraine was and is just the last straw that broke the back of the food security in Africa, and which led to let's say, as experts say, a perfect storm, a perfect humanitarian crisis in the continent. If we have a look at the numbers, even before the invasion of Ukraine, globally 1.1 billion people suffered in the lack of food insecurity. After the invasion, thanks to Mr. Putin, this number rose above 1.6 billion. Currently, the latest data, almost 450 million people around the globe living in acute food insecurity, which it means actually that they are on the brink of starvation. And while we are speaking on the nuclear escalation is a potential, it's fact on the ground that people are dying because of the famine and starvation on different parts of the Middle East and Africa. According to rough estimations of different NGOs, every fourth second, one people die because of malnutrition and starvation. It means that 20,000 people each day is dying currently while we are sitting here in this crisis. Most of them now in the sub-Saharan part of Africa, Somalia, the Sahel region, and to lesser extent Sudan and South Sudan. And it has also an important effect on migration. Currently, mainly on IDPs in the continent. Even before the start of the war, there were more than 30 million refugees and IDPs in Africa. After the breakout of the war, it increased almost by 4 million people. And it's very important to underline that these are the official data. But the unofficial data is many times more. Just one example, I visited Egypt in last October. That time, according to the data of IOM, 6.5 million foreign people were in Egypt, mainly from Sudan and South Sudan, so the sub-Saharan part. Currently, 1 year later, the data is almost 9 million only in Egypt, and only, it's very important, these are the official data. Unofficial data can say it's 15 million people, foreign-born migrants, currently in Egypt. And the shift is definitely because the deteriorating food situation on the ground. As I mentioned, Ukraine was just the last straw. Africa is going through a deep humanitarian crisis because of different structural issues, which emerged mainly in the last 2 years, or partially in the last 2 years. We don't have time to go to the details. I would like to mention only some of them. Of course, demography, the huge demographic pressure still on the continent. The latest report of the United Nations just came out from the world population trends, and definitely still the population in Africa is booming, and it's will still booming at the end of this century, while by the mid of this century, all other continent will stop in the increase. Food crisis, ladies and gentlemen, food crisis has started to increase since May 2020, and there is not stop in this process. Even before the invasion, 24th of February, the prices increased of different foods between 50 and 100%. It's very important. These are, in many cases, not the official number, but the real numbers. I visited Addis Ababa in May, and people complained me that official inflation, just around 30%, but the price of, for example, cafe or teff, the grain that they are using, doubled in the last 6 months before my visit. And after the invasion, an additional 50-100% increase happened also in the prices of food, which means a huge burden of households. Currently, in many households in sub-Saharan Africa, spending 60 or definitely 100% of their money for food. Drought. Why the increase of food prices started 2 years ago? Because of the different effects of climate change. In East Africa, 4 rainy seasons failed in the last 2 years, and it seems that unfortunately the 5th will fail also. In some region, it means that between 80 and 95% of the whole livestock, because there are nomadic population here, has already perished. And ladies and gentlemen, it's also very important to underline then for agriculture, if the rain arrives, it means that within 2 or 4 months they will have crops. But if animals are dying, and it happened, it will take between 7 and 10 years to gain the same amount of the herds, which happened before the famine. It destroyed the whole food supply chain in certain parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. We saw similar drought in West Africa, also the lack of rains in the last 1.5 years. And we shouldn't forget the effects of the pandemic, ladies and gentlemen, because during COVID-19, these communities have already lived up their reserves. At the beginning of the COVID, they could have some reserves to survive, to share it among the certain communities, families. Now, it was exploited. There's no any potential to involve more money and food into system. And as I mentioned, some actors, and it's very evident, like jihadist organizations or insurgency groups, for example, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, utilizing the starvation to demonstrate themselves as potential actors distributing food or destroy government humanitarian support for the population to jeopardize the credibility of central governments. We should mention also the shocking energy prices, which also fuel inflation. It's also common sense. And political challenges, ladies and gentlemen. We see all the new civil wars in different parts of the continent, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and the Sahel, which also make extremely hard to feed the population in different parts of the drought-affected areas. And we should mention also political instability. For example, in coups in the Sahel region, 6 coups happened in the last 2 years in different countries of West Africa. It's very important also to emphasize that it's a new phenomenon. Africa was the house of coup during the Cold War, but it ceased to exist in the 90s and the early 20s. Unfortunately, it seems that because of political instability, because of social challenges, coups are returning to the continent. And the last straw, Ukraine, many African countries, not only in the sub-Saharan part, also in the northern part of the continent, imported most of their grains and different foods from both Ukraine or Russia. For example, in the case of the aforementioned Somalia, it was above 90%, but also, for example, in the case of Egypt, with its 110 million population, also 80% of the food arrived from Ukraine and Russia. It's almost completely stopped. And while, for example, Egypt, which has a relatively strong government, still as a dominant regional power and extending networks, it managed to bridge this gap. And Cairo found alternative supply lines. But for example, Somalia, South Sudan, as I mentioned, as let's say at least fragile or failed states, they don't have capacity to find alternative sources. The only potential is the aid from international organizations. But don't forget that international NGOs and the United Nations and bilateral donors currently have to cope not only the food crisis in Africa, but also in the Middle East and South Asia, not to mention the refugee crisis from Ukraine, which was mentioned by Christoph. Regularly are focusing on just this food issue, but but the Ukrainian crisis has also, and the war has also effects on other sectors, which also contributed to the economic decline in Africa. For example, tourism. In Egypt, 25% of tourists arrive from Ukraine and Russia. Now there's nobody. It means that hundreds of thousands of jobs had disappeared from the system. So these people can't earn money, so they can't feed their families there also. Or we see the limited number of investment. We see, of course, less political attention for the crisis, both from the West and from Russia and China on the continent. And the new Cold War competition, which is emerging in the continent, of course, not only in the last months, but in the last years, also jeopardized the potential for an international cooperation to tackle somehow with these crises. What's the current situation on migration? As I mentioned, actually, mass starvation and actually dying because of malnutrition started since June, which led to the increasing number of IDPs. People are trying to reach refugee camps, settlements, or at least cities where they can find some food, some support, or some job. We don't know the exact numbers. Of course, in Africa, it's a never easy issue. Only in Somalia, since the beginning of this year, 1 million people wandered to the cities and the refugee settlements. All around the continent, as I mentioned, it must be millions since the beginning of this year, if not tens of millions of people. We see the effects also on the borders of Europe. Somebody argues that the starving people will flood Europe. No, it's still not true, and it will not be true because it's not so easy to reach Europe without the assistance of smuggling networks, which cost a lot of money. Now, it's in the sub-Saharan Africa, it influenced the local political stability, which of course later can generate a bigger migration. But who are coming in an increasing number? People from North Africa. Still, if we have a look at the statistics, most people's coming from Africa in the different Mediterranean routes to Europe, they are coming from the MENA region and from Morocco to Egypt. What we can see now, the increasing number of people from the middle class who are leaving because of the wrong economic situation and because of the lack of perspectives. It's shocking, ladies and gentlemen, that visiting Egypt, or I came back 3 weeks ago from Tunisia, speaking with young people, everybody actually literally wants to leave their countries. And the main destination is definitely Europe. And it's also some words about the numbers, because comparing with the illegal border crossing attempts in the southern part of the United States, perhaps these numbers are not so high. But in Tunisia, people told me the real numbers are 3 or 4 times more what the European Coast Guards realize, because most people don't want to make a touch with the local authorities because they are afraid to be deported back. So middle class is leaving, and it's very important that they have still the financial background to make the crossing to Europe in illegal channels. So the conclusion, Africa is going through an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, which haven't happened in the last 4 decades at least. And in the shadow of the war in Ukraine, actually it's a little hope for more support for the continent. In the last months, actually, we saw a lot of steps. For example, from the United States, USAID offered $1.4 billion just for East Africa. And it's also very important to underline that the main donors for the continent still Western countries and organizations. But watching the number of people in suffer, only in East Africa, by the end of this year, 50 million people will need food supply. It's just a drop in the ocean. And it will mean a huge burden for Europe, which is already been struggling with multiple challenges, from refugee crisis to increasing energy prices and inflation. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. If you have any question, I'm ready to answer it.